Self-directed learning as a youth. My youngest experiences with self-directed learning are hard to recall because I was so young, but I definitely learned to walk and talk before I attended any form of school. I remember playing with Legos a lot as a young child, starting with building the models as depicted in the instructions and then building my own creations. We had an old suitcase that my brother and I combined all our Lego pieces together into to create a large collection of parts and pieces that we could create with. This freedom to explore and create things was never with coercion or instruction. We were simply free to play. I later got into Capsella, which was similar to Legos but included motors and gears. This wasn't as exciting as Lego because the parts were expensive, so we didn't have a lot of them, which limited my options on what I could build beyond what was described in the manuals. While this would give some indication that I'd later become an engineer, there were also indications that I would become a writer. My family owned an old typewriter, and I remember writing short stories on it. When my parents moved a few years ago, I found some of these old stories buried in boxes in their attic. It was strange to read my own childhood writings were mystical stories about magic and warlocks and sorcerers and teleportation and time travel. I never submitted these stories to anyone to read or publish. This was just something I did for fun when I was really young. I also remember being into baseball when I was young. My brother and I collected tons of baseball cards and even wrote letters to baseball players asking them for autographs. The trick was to include their baseball card and a self-addressed stamped envelope in our letter so they could easily sign it and send it back. When my brother, myself, and a couple neighbors would play 2-on-2 wiffle ball, we'd hold imaginary drafts to create make-believe professional teams. We'd pretend we were the different players at bat, keep track of all the statistics, and then calculate our batting averages and other statistics as we role-played each player. The childish make-believe nature of this game is a little strange and mildly embarrassing, but clearly required some creativity and learning a little bit of math. Again, the point is, these were our self-directed activities, and we were learning through play. Back on the tech side of things, I also enjoyed playing with computers at a young age. My family got our first computer when I was 7 years old, and it consumed my attention. My interest in computers led me to building my first website at age 11. The website was simple, but all websites were simple back in 1997. I didn't do this because anyone told me to. I just thought it was super cool to have my own place on the web. The first website I made was mostly about video games, and I'll admit most of the content was copied off other websites. At the time, nobody ever indicated to me that building websites was potentially a valuable skill. Though I did end up creating one website, which earned me some money as a teen, I wasn't doing this professionally, and I didn't even know web development was a viable career option. I wasn't able to pursue this interest in elementary, middle, or high school since there was no class offered on web development or any kind of computer programming. I tried buying a book on programming titled C++ for Dummies and hated it. In my senior year of high school, at the Academy of Math and Science, they did offer a C++ programming class, which wasn't related to websites, and it was miserable. I did like the teacher, but taking a formal programming class was painfully dry, boring, and slow. There's a few lessons from my experiences of building websites that I want you to pay attention to. 1. Learning often moves much faster without being part of a class. 2. Sometimes it's much better to have a project, like building a website, to work on that allows you to learn skills along the way rather than to focus solely on the skills, like learning to code. And 3, what often looks like play to people can actually be real learning. I can't complete talking about building websites as a kid without sharing a conversation I had with my high school guidance counselor during my junior year when I told her I was interested in going to college to study web development and to try to make a career out of building websites. She advised me against this path because she thought I wouldn't enjoy being strapped to a desk all day and that she heard most programming jobs were moving overseas. Little did she know that software development would become one of the most lucrative career paths one could take, and that we'd all be walking around with laptops in our backpacks, allowing incredible mobility. I won't hold it against her personally that she was wrong. After all, it was 2003, and she had no way of knowing what the future would hold. But it is indicative that our guidance counselors and adults in our lives can't predict the future. It is likely that the reason software became so pervasive in our society is that so many young people were passionate about the subject and found ways to solve technical problems using software, thus creating a market for it which didn't exist beforehand. In middle school and my first year of high school, I started to get into music. I learned to play guitar and joined a band. Our name was Dark Descent, and we rocked. While I did take some lessons at one point, the idea of learning guitar and taking classes was based on my own interests. To be clear, self-directed learning doesn't mean you can't take a class. You absolutely can, as long as you are choosing to take it. When I was in the band, we reached a point where we'd written a few of our own songs and wanted to expand our audience beyond our lead guitarist's basement. We wanted to get gigs. This involved recording a CD and contacting local clubs. While I was the least talented musically, I was pretty sharp with computers and helped us get the album recorded and burned onto CDs. I then wrote letters to local venues, including a copy of our CD, and we ended up getting booked for a handful of paying gigs. We didn't become famous rock stars, but definitely got our taste of being real performers. One claim to fame is that we were once the opening act for a band called Soil when they came to Hartford, Connecticut in September 2001. And by the summer of 2002, Soil was the opening act for Ozzy Osbourne. The valuable lesson to get from this is that sometimes an interest in one subject, like guitar, can naturally evolve into learning many other valuable skills that you never intended from the beginning, like how to use recording equipment and software and business promotion. Of course, I also created a website for our band and continued developing my programming skills. Another passion of mine in high school was weightlifting and nutrition. Since I played basketball and was only 5 feet 8 inches, I felt that the only way for me to compete was to be faster and stronger than anyone else. I remember reading countless articles on the web about the best training techniques, regimens, the biology of how muscle was generated, and what was an ideal diet for athletes. I never fulfilled my dreams of playing in the NBA, but I did develop healthy eating and exercise habits at a young age. By the time I took biology class in high school, I was already familiar with a lot of the topics, and the classes felt much more practical and relatable. I then used my class time to raise my hand and ask the teacher lots of questions that pertained to my own personal interests in training and nutrition, thus getting a lot of value out of the teacher as a resource. Another interest I pursued in high school was gambling. I became fascinated with casino games like craps and blackjack, as well as skill-based games like poker. While one could critique the merits of learning about such questionable activities, there is no questioning that these were practical ways of exploring probabilities and statistics. I also can't leave out that I now have 3 adult friends who have made a living as professional poker players, so there must be some value to this skill. This leads to a subject that can't be avoided in any discussion about self-directed learning, which is video games. The educational value of video games is an often debated subject in the self-directed learning world. One perspective is that only games that are designed specifically to be educational can be valuable, while other people believe that all games have some learning component to them. When my family got our first computer, my parents purchased some education-specific games, though I didn't play them a lot. I think they underestimated the educational value that was inherent to freely exploring a novel technology like a computer, even without any special games. Figuring out how to get on the internet, install and remove software, update software, and install hardware were useful skills for a young child. In particular, it was when the computer broke that I learned the most, which happened pretty frequently. Fixing my parents' computer often involved navigating DOS, formatting the hard drive, reinstalling the operating system, reloading drivers, and other advanced technical challenges that you couldn't learn from a game. My favorite games to play tended to be problem-solving games like Chip's Challenge on PC and games like Mario or Zelda on the NES and Nintendo 64. The greatest pleasure I got from video games was for multiplayer gaming, which has value in learning communication and collaboration skills. With computer gaming specifically, I remember learning about computer networks for LAN play and direct IP gaming because we didn't have online communities like Steam or Xbox Live to connect through. I also experimented a little with graphic design software used in computer games using 3D Studio Max. My interest in gaming waned by the time Nintendo GameCube came out, though I did get pretty heavy into Super Smash Bros. In college with my roommates. There's definitely some interpersonal skills and personal development from playing competitive games in a playful manner with your peers. When people hear that I briefly taught high school physics, they usually assume I became interested in physics because I studied it in middle or high school. That is definitely not the case. Up until my junior year of college, I really did not like physics at all, despite taking multiple physics classes in high school and even being an engineering major in college. My personal exploration and love for physics started when I was a junior in college. I watched a couple fascinating YouTube videos about physics, became interested in the subject, and purchased a handful of physics books from the bookstore, like Brian Greene's Elegant Universe and Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. Before this, I don't remember ever buying a book purely for my own personal pleasure. I became completely hooked with this mysterious, magical world of understanding the nature of reality, an obsession that still carries to the present day. My interest in physics brings up an important point, which is that I was consuming information for the joy of learning and understanding, not as part of a particular project. It's important to emphasize that not all self-directed learning has to be project-based learning. The two overlap sometimes, and that can be a lot of fun, but it's not required. One disappointment in my self-directed learning as a teen involves stand-up comedy. While I generally tell people I started performing comedy around my 27th birthday, I actually gave it a try in high school as well. I had become a huge fan of stand-up and spent a year writing joke ideas in a notepad and then wrote out a 5-minute routine. My dad drove a friend and me to an open mic in Boston where I performed the set. While I did get some laughs, the experience was really disappointing. It felt really unnatural being this young kid performing for adults. I wish I had some kind of mentor or coach to talk it all through with, but instead, I didn't have anyone who really supported this interest, and I ended up putting my comedy dreams on the back burner for a decade. It's important to remember that self-directed learning isn't all about doing things completely by yourself. Finding the right mentors or people to support you is an important piece of the puzzle. One last adventure in self-directed learning for my youth was when I started rock climbing during college. Some people wouldn't consider this to be a learning experience because we think of athletics as being so far removed from academics. I want to include it for a reason. I played lots of sports as a child, like basketball, baseball, and soccer. These were all sports that I was surrounded by growing up. The rules were well defined by the professional leagues. There was a local league to join that was organized by adults. There were adult coaches. The games were already organized, and there were lots of support and encouragement, and some pressure, for every kid in town to join these teams. Rock climbing was different. I got into rock climbing simply out of curiosity when I saw an indoor climbing wall at the gym at my university. It was my curiosity that drove me to rent a pair of climbing shoes and first experiment with climbing on the wall. It was my own self-drive and interest that had me take an intro course to learn how to belay a climbing partner. It was my own self-direction that led me to make friends with people who were into outdoor climbing, so I could tag along on their climbing trips and learn how to do outdoor climbing as well. Rock climbing was a big part of my life in my 20s, and I've learned a great deal along the way about maneuvering my body, the technical aspects of setting up anchors, and how to challenge myself emotionally in dire situations.